This was really, really good.
You just earned yourself a detention, sir.
Me with you is already one big detention.
Son of a...
The Holdovers is a new dramedy film from director Alexander Payne, starring Paul Giamatti as an old-school, crotchety teacher at an all-boys boarding school academy. It also stars Divine Joy Randolph as a grieving cook at the school, and Dominic Sessa as the main holdover boy who spends a lot of time with Paul Giamatti's character. Essentially, The Holdovers is, as the name suggests, following, at least initially, a group of boys who are held over at their boarding school over Christmas break, over the holidays, as either they can't go home or perhaps their family doesn't want them there. These boys are forced to spend all day with Paul Giamatti's character, and it starts off as a pretty classic comedy, jokes amongst the boys, jokes at their teacher's expense, but it turns into so much more when all of the boys, save for Dominic Sessa's character, go on a ski trip, and he alone is left with his teacher and the grieving cook. As you watch this film, it will be pretty impossible to not draw some comparisons to other films, perhaps most notably Dead Poet Society from Peter Weir, which is one of my all-time favorites. And of course, these comparisons are valid to an extent. It follows an all-boys boarding school, somewhat unorthodox teacher that is perhaps disliked by administration and has prior connections to the school itself. Plus, Paul Giamatti's character drops a Latin line pretty much every single scene, although no single line may carry the same weight as Carpe Diem from Robin Williams. Still, The Holdovers is its own film. Yes, it follows some classic tropes, but it also carves out its own path. And honestly, I was pretty in love with this film right from the opening sequence. The cinematography from Eigil Brild was really amazing. We immediately feel as though we are in the 1970s. Not just that we're watching a film that's set in that era, but that we're physically there with the characters. We see this grainy filmic look that helps in that regard. We feel warm and invited in. We have the very classic kind of opening credit sequence that sets the stage for the story that we're about to be immersed in. Brild's work here is nothing crazy, it's nothing earth-shattering, but every technical decision that was made here seemed to work. There was a lot of locked-off cameras, tripods, and Brild himself has been quoted as saying that there is no camera movement in this film that does not have a specific purpose. That being said, there are quite a few pans, but again, they're always trying to illustrate something. It will land on a particular character or perhaps a piece of art that's being displayed in the school that adds to the narrative threads of the story. Beyond that, Brild uses and utilizes quite well a lot of very tight, close shots, which only works if the actors are up to the task, which thankfully in this particular film they really were. And earlier I mentioned that this film would be considered by most to be a dramedy. And I have an interesting kind of connection to that word because for me, most films that try to fall under that genre usually fail at least one of the two halves. Perhaps they lean very heavily into the drama, bordering on the melodrama, and they lose the comedic aspects. Or, on the other hand, the jokes may land, but they take away from the overall drama and tension of the story. What Payne does well here with the Holdovers is finding a balance between the two, between comedy and drama. The film starts off fairly lighthearted as we learn more about these teenage boys and their teacher. But as most of the boys leave and we're just left with Dominic Sessa's character, it moves into that drama territory, but still remains hilarious. I found myself honestly laughing out loud in the theater pretty much every single scene here. And that's a difficult task, to have the audience on the verge of tears at one moment and then continuing those tears but having them form out of laughter instead. The Holdovers does touch on a lot of pretty deep topics, but it doesn't force emotion onto the audience. It explores elements of mental illness, of loneliness and isolation. It touches heavily on the irony that we experience as humans as we simultaneously long for connection, but then often push those possible connections away. It tiptoes into each of these areas effectively, but does not leave the humor behind. In fact, at some of the darkest moments of the film, it leans into its humor almost as a reminder that when we are experiencing this pain and this sorrow, comedy is more important than ever. Similarly, the Holdovers kind of tiptoes into territory of social messaging and kind of broader thematic statements. But again, it is not hitting you over the head with a thesis. Yes, it touches upon wealth and potential power imbalances that still exist in our schools, as it explores a very elite boys-only academy. Within that, it also mentions directly or indirectly this idea of whiteness. We see portraits of previous leaders of the school, and they all look eerily similar, and we have pans through the cafeteria as we see white man after white man after white man, and the only people of color are either being discriminated against or are in positions of service. But again, it's not hitting you over the head with a social justice message. It's just highlighting the reality of these power imbalances in these certain institutions. And it even goes so far to suggest that just because there may be these broad implications of power and privilege, it doesn't mean that we can judge individual beings that are living in this system. Dominic Sessa's character on the surface might seem to be privileged and ungrateful, but as we get to know him and the pain that he has experienced, we start to understand that there's more than meets the eye. I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention this soundtrack. If you like older music from the 70s and some before the 70s, this film has some amazing tracks. We hear the Allman Brothers, we hear Cat Stevens, we get some jazz from Artie Shaw in a very emotional Christmas Eve scene, and the soundtrack is propped up by the score from Mark Orton, which is subtle, it's not in your face, it's not grandiose in any sort of way, but it creates this sense of warmth that surrounds really the whole film. Okay, performances. Believe it or not, this is Dominic Sessa's debut performance. He auditioned, he got the role, and he performed quite admirably. As I mentioned previously, the director and cinematographer here rely on quite a few very tight, close shots, and Dominic is often the subject of these. He has an uncanny ability to share so much emotion with just his eyes, which is certainly commendable for such a young actor. There's also a scene where he does a wonderful round off, which apparently he just told Alexander Payne that he could do that, and they said, okay, well, let's give it a shot, and it remained in the film. We also have an amazing performance from Davine Joy Randolph, who is so funny in this film. Her comedic timing is absolutely impeccable. We can see and hear and feel so much from just a raise of the eyebrow or a roll of the eyes or a little sigh that she might elicit. But not only is she funny, but she's also one of the characters that is carrying tremendous weight of grief following the loss of her son in the Vietnam War. And Randolph's performance in this sense is almost a microcosm of the film itself. She beautifully balances humor and pain and shows again potentially the healing power of comedy, of laughter, when you are confronted with a seemingly unbearable weight of grief. Of course, the performance that everyone is talking about is Paul Giamatti's, rightfully so. I don't say this lightly because when you look at his filmography, it is extremely dense. He has a tremendous breadth of work, but this is probably his greatest performance ever. There is so much weight placed on his shoulders, and he, as his character, is slowly revealing different layers to himself. If he does this too quickly or too obviously, then we lose that dramatic tension. But if he doesn't reveal anything at all, then we kind of lose the stakes and the power of the narrative. He is hilarious, dropping random pieces of knowledge about ancient civilization onto strangers who really don't care, including a very haggard and inebriated Santa Claus at one point. He is also very much a man who is in pain, a man who is feeling isolated and lonely, but is unable to put himself into a space where he can feel loved and accepted. Giamatti does a wonderful job of portraying such a complex character, and I fully understand and support the wave that has been behind him, kind of pushing him toward a Best Actor nomination at the Academy Awards. Paul Giamatti's character had so many memorable quotes in this film, it's actually pretty absurd. In fact, this whole film is just full of quotable moments, which is part of the reason why I can't wait to go back and explore it. One particular quote of many that stands out to me from Giamatti is when he's speaking to Dominic Sessa's character, and he says something that's not entirely new, something that's been said before, but takes on a little bit of a different power and meaning in the context of this film. He says to Dominic's character, history is not simply the study of the past, but it's an explanation of the present. And of course, one could take that quote at face value. Of course, ancient civilization, things that have occurred before, have led us to where we are now. But in that moment, really, he's talking about himself and Dominic's character. Both of them have experienced pain, are grieving, are feeling isolated, and this is a result of what has happened to them in their lives to this point. However, he remains optimistic, particularly when it comes to his students, ensuring that just because that history has occurred, it doesn't need to then dictate our future as well. Overall, I love this film. In fact, it's one of my favorite films of the year so far. That being said, I would give it 4.5 stars out of 5. Some reasons to watch this film: obviously, the performances are brilliant, and I think it brings a little bit of something for everyone. It's hilarious, it's heartfelt, it approaches melodrama at times, but it never loses its kind of roots and its grounded feel. A reason maybe not to watch this film: it's tougher for me to find one. I think that everyone would enjoy it to varying degrees, but perhaps you could say that it's not bringing anything entirely new to the table. The story, the relationship between teacher and student, and the learning that happens along the way is not new. And some of the jokes perhaps could be a little bit cartoonish or seen as such. Regardless, I would definitely recommend seeing this one. It might just be my new classic Christmas film for years to come. If you've made it this far, appreciate it. You can do that subscribe thing, that like thing, that comment thing. I don't know. Do your thing. And yeah, hopefully you watch the next one. Cheers.